I'd like to invite you to take a seat, and I would like to introduce the third and final panel of the day. The last panel was so rich with ideas, and I'm sure we could continue discussing it well into the evening. It raised so many questions. One of them, to my mind, was how we're going to support the guilt of not investing more heavily into poverty alleviation and affordable technologies that solve problems people really have around the world. And I have a feeling that that question may come up in this next panel. That sort of orientation may come up in this next panel. We have 5 very interesting people. They're each going to speak for about 20 minutes, and I will not go into details. I just want to introduce them very quickly in the order in which they'll be speaking. We begin with Erwin Redlener, who is the director of the National Center for Disaster Preparedness here at Columbia, and also the president of the Children's Health Fund. We'll move to Lindsay Hoshaw, who is the communications director of MIT's Sensible City Laboratory, and Noah Tolley, who's the director of urban studies and an assistant professor at Wheaton College. Dana Fisher, who's an associate professor of sociology here at Columbia, and then Amit Srivastava, who's the coordinator of the India Resource Center, and who I don't see yet. But we'll begin with Dr. Redlener, and we have about 20 minutes per person. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My role here is to make sure that if you weren't depressed enough after Klaus Jacob's talk, that I would be the capper and make sure you left here completely despairing. No, I listened with great interest to what Klaus had to say about the long-term realities that we're facing, and really what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about the current state of readiness in terms of being prepared for large-scale disasters, which I call megadisasters, and I'm going to define those in a minute, but I was interested in the fact that Klaus refers to the mega cities, and I'll talk about mega disasters. And so the big question is, are we prepared in any sense of that concept currently for large-scale disasters? So thank you very much. I'll stop. So that's if I had a really short amount of time. But let me give you a little more detail. It's only fair. The high price of admission would certainly warrant that. So before I get into the main perspectives that I want to share with you, I have 2 sort of caveats that underpin a lot of where we've come in terms of my center in understanding disasters and the level of preparedness about them. The first point is that we are not concerned, that's negative, we're not concerned about the capacity of virtually everywhere in the United States to respond to and deal with a small emergency or even a small disaster. It's just as we go up the scale of impact and consequences of particular disaster scenarios that we become increasingly less capable of preparing for, preventing, mitigating, responding to, recovering from large-scale disasters. And I want to just spend a minute on what I mean by megadisasters so you understand where I'm coming from. So the idea behind a megadisaster is a catastrophic event of very high consequence, no matter what the cause, whether it's terrorism or natural events or whatever it might be, but that catastrophe overwhelms the local capacity or the regional response to be able to respond effectively. And you know you are dealing with a megadisaster because, first of all, you may, and in the most dramatic reality of a megadisaster, and take Port-au-Prince and last January's horrible earthquake in Haiti, the inability to manage the immediate rescue of survivors who are endangered. In the case of a big earthquake like that, there's a 72-hour window that is medically a medically legitimate period of time where you have to get people out of rubble if you're going to have any chance of helping them to survive whatever the event was. after 72 hours, the fatality rates rise dramatically. And the international community basically and entirely missed that window. And this was probably the most dramatic example of local capacity, given the condition of Haiti before the earthquake, of local capacity being unable to do this very basic function. But this also happened in New Orleans around Katrina. It happens in other places. So the first rule is, can you rescue people that need medical care? The second potential feature of a mega disaster is you've rescued people, you've extracted them, but you don't have the healthcare response capacity to save lives, to treat people that you've now pulled from the rubble or you've extracted them from the roof of their house in New Orleans after the flooding. Now you got to take them someplace to deal with injuries, and the local healthcare system is incapable of providing that vital care. The third point, and these are in priority order obviously, is the inability to protect vital infrastructure or prevent significant destruction of property and material goods, whether it's food or the electrical grid system or the sewer system, whatever it might be. That becomes also very important. If you can handle those kinds of things locally, then you're probably not in mega disaster range. But if it's a situation where you're calling people in or people are coming in from bordering states, from other regions, from other countries, from the UN, et cetera, you're into mega disaster land. And finally, and this is actually extremely rare, hardly ever do we see, because of a disaster, uncontrolled societal breakdown. But one might imagine that if that were the case with a population under siege from any kind of disaster, that would also represent the need for external resources to come in and assist in dealing with whatever has to be dealt with there. So it's this mega disaster kind of situation that gives us the most concern. And surprisingly, we're not a whole lot better prepared than we were on 9/11 to deal with the mega disaster at that point. And I'm going to get into that in a second. The second caveat, which I've always found very interesting, is this: we talk about preparedness or doing things that make us ready for disasters, but we actually don't know what prepared means. We don't know what the definition of that, and not only don't we know what the definition of that is for a society, a community, a city, we also don't happen to know what it means for an individual. Now, you could say, if we are abiding by the recommendations of the Red Cross or FEMA, we have 3 days of food and water, battery-operated radio, and that whole array of things that people suggest that you do, that you've met a criteria for being prepared. However, that set of recommendations does nothing for you in the event of a major pandemic where you may have to stay holed up in your place for several weeks. Famously, President Bush's Secretary of Health and Human Services had, this is no joke, 9 weeks worth of tuna fish cans under his bed. And knowing him, it's sort of true. But the point I'm trying to make here is that what you need, or is the 3 days of food and water and so forth, and what does that actually mean? And if we can't define it as individuals, and if we can't define where we're going, if we don't know what the goal is for a prepared New York or Madrid or Haiti, for instance, how is it that we're setting benchmarks? What are we trying to accomplish? How much is it going to cost? Without having a goal for what the building looks like when you're building a house, you're building a skyscraper, you have a cost estimate, and you have a process, and you finally get there at sometimes within the range of the predicted cost. But if you're talking about getting prepared for a city, we're in some other zone where it's very difficult. By the way, how many of you think that you are prepared for a mega disaster that might happen in our region or your region, wherever it might be? Yes, sir. Oh, yeah. Yeah. I almost had like a little arrhythmia there for a second. Yeah. And by the way, I've asked this question of medical audiences, of the CDC at a lecture we gave there, and anybody I speak to, and there's hardly any hands that go up. And but you think about what that means and extrapolate your own experience to what you think our public officials are actually doing. Let me see. So the problem is that however we define prepared or preparedness, that it remains true that the United States of America And virtually every other country in the world is not prepared for an array of disasters which some people might consider appropriate. The UK is pretty prepared for a lot of disasters. It has done zero to deal with the possibility of nuclear terrorism in London, for instance. And I just spoke to the senior official in the UK about that, and I said, why not? He said, because they don't want to. I said, all right, there you go. So I'm going to talk about some barriers that keep us from getting prepared. There's actually probably a dozen or so that I could talk about, but we're just going to pick out a few that I think are most important. So first one that I want to discuss is this notion of the scale and scope of planning for mega disasters. Are we investing enough money, for instance, in our planning process for a very severe 1918 Spanish flu-like pandemic? Are we preparing for a destabilization of the seismic underpinning of New York, or the West Coast for that matter, or the New Madrid seismic vulnerability in the middle of the country? And really not. And really, if it was deemed expensive before the recession, it's now deemed just bizarrely inappropriate to even bring to the table. The amount of money, for instance, that the American Society of Civil Engineers say that just to fix the infrastructure in the U.S., I'm sure many of you know this, is in the order of $2.7 trillion. Now, I personally, if you would ask me privately, I'd say, what a great jobs program, and we should probably do something like that. But the fact is, the appetite for large expenditures on basically what would amount to a life insurance policy is not in the cards anytime soon. You know, it's like if you were making $150,000 a year, your job evaporated, and you were unemployed for 9 months, and then you get a new job for $75,000 a year. You may be cutting back on what you're going to invest in the future, as in retirement planning, health insurance, disability insurance or life insurance. And I think, again, that is something that is magnified, and the same sort of thing happens in planning for large-scale disasters. Really, I want to give you an example of one of the things we dealt with a few years ago when we're worried about the H5N1. That's the pre-swine flu, was in the bird flu era of the middle of this decade. Governor Pataki made an announcement with a press release that he was going to invest $29 million for New York State pandemic avian flu planning. And I wrote an op-ed about it because the fact is we needed 10 times that to get to a level of readiness for the pandemic. It's this kind of scalar discrepancies that have not been absorbed by officials or people that appropriate public dollars. In no circumstances that I'm aware of is enough money appropriated to do whatever the job is. You want to see the U.S. hospitals, for instance, prepared for large-scale disasters. It's 5,000 hospitals. We originally were investing $500 million a year spread among those hospitals to bring them up to some level of response capacity. That's been dropping. It's now about $400 million. It would actually take a $5 billion initial bonus and then $1 billion a year to get them up someplace. Now, literally, you have a hospital with let's say $1.5 billion a year annual budget, and they're getting $86,000 to do preparedness from the federal government. You know, that almost pays for a nurse. That's good. But the fact is that this kind of really wildly inappropriate absence of appropriate resources is very, very unsettling. And I want to go through another specific example here, and I want to talk about pandemic flu in New York City to give you some more clarity about what this point is. So let's say we have 8.2 million people here in the metropolitan area, and if we had a severe H5N1 attack, or severe one, then we could expect about 30% of the population to get infected. Now, many people who got infected would have a mild cold. Some would be much sicker, and I'm going to tell you what that looks like. About 10% of the people who got sick, so 10% of the 30% would require hospitalization. And the mortality rate is around 2.5% of those that get infected would not survive. That's more or less what all the models, when we talk about the impact of a pandemic flu, what they reflect for New York City. So what would happen is, under these circumstances, that we'd have about almost 2.5 million New Yorkers, including 600,000 children, with some level of the flu, 60,000 deaths, including 15,000 pediatric deaths, and 200,000 hospital admissions over, say, an 8-week to 10-week period. And if it was a shorter period, let's say it was 6 or 7 weeks, that'd be about 300 deaths per day on average. And there would not be enough, and this is categorically true, not be enough vaccine, if there was a vaccine available, not enough Tamiflu or other antiviral medications, there would not be enough hospital beds, there certainly wouldn't be enough mechanical ventilators and so on and so forth. And then there's a whole series of cascading events that flow from the public health crisis that we'd be facing. So schools would be closed because we don't want kids infecting one another. Parents would be sick. There would be possible quarantines. The economy would be in unimaginable amounts of trouble in addition to what we have now. And little assistance from the outside because, even though it would be a mega disaster for New York, well, Chicago and Hartford and Newark are all experiencing the same thing. That's what makes it a pandemic. It's virtually everywhere at once. So extra ventilators from another place is not going to happen. The second barrier, so that's all about this discrepancy, what I just said, between resources available and what might be needed in a particular scenario. The second barrier has to do with the level of coordination horizontally in the system and regionally when it comes to the geography of what we're talking about here. And I want to say for a minute or two that the government's ability to organize a large-scale disaster response is D- if we're going to grade it. And it depends on the scenario. It ranges from F to maybe D+ for large-scale disasters. Now, I'm going to come to some question about what we've learned from previous experience with disasters in the U.S. and elsewhere for that matter, and give you some background for why this is, but we'll get there momentarily. But I wanted to take a couple of minutes to talk about a specific example where the necessity for extreme amount of planning, for an extreme amount of coordination is absolutely vital. So we're going to posit an act of nuclear terrorism. I do not mean a dirty bomb, which is just a conventional explosive contaminated with some radioactive material. I'm talking about the detonation of an atomic or other kind of nuclear weapon similar to what was used in Hiroshima or Nagasaki at the end of World War II. And so if we talk about, let's say, a 10 to 12 kiloton atomic weapon that's exploded in a major city, what actually would happen? Now, if any of you, I don't see anybody, but if any of you are over the age of 40, no, nobody, you would probably remember our collective mindset. I have a Medicare card. He's sneering at me, this gentleman here for the reason. Our collective mindset during the Cold War was that if there was a nuclear confrontation between the Soviet Union and the United States, there's no survival and we have nothing to talk about, and that's absolutely 100% true. It was either prevention or nothing. There was no civil defense, was pointless and really was mocked as a joke by people who knew what was going on. And a lot of physicians like myself were going around and saying, hey, we better prevent this. We have no medicine, we have no system that will deal with a nuclear confrontation. That mindset, unfortunately, has lingered among a lot of our emergency planners, including the New York City Department of the Office of Emergency Management. There's a very great psychological barrier, unwillingness to think about planning for nuclear terrorism because they're thinking old days. And that's really quite unfortunate. Well, so what we have here, these are the 6 target cities that are considered the most likely in the event that some organization decided they were going to try to acquire, which is possible, a nuclear weapon. So San Francisco, Los Angeles, Houston, Chicago, Washington, and New York are the places not to be under those circumstances. So if, again, I'm just going to rush through a little bit of this, but a 10-kiloton nuclear detonation in New York City, hundreds of thousands of people with injuries would be presented. And by the way, if it happened in lower Manhattan, we right here would not be immediately killed or even necessarily close to being killed. We might, there would be windows blown out, there might be some fire started, but all of us in this room would be potential survivors if we had a clue as to what to do and if we had even a little bit of information from the appropriate people in government, which we're not going to have, and you're not going to know, but we'll get to that at the end of this. And actually the modelers from Lawrence Livermore Labs have said the delta between a little bit of planning and no planning is several 100,000 lives lost or saved if we did a very small amount of readiness. Anyway, so there are hundreds of thousands, right, of casualties who need medical care. This is not just New York City now, this is New York State. The total number of hospital beds is maybe 30 to 40,000. A lot of them obviously occupied, and a lot of those occupants of those beds are very sick. They're not going anywhere, right? 3 minutes, okay. So the discrepancy between what's available and what might be needed is spectacular. This is part of a modeling exercise that we did to see where New Yorkers would go after, this happened to be a dirty bomb, but you can also do this, we have it for a nuclear detonation and other disasters, but a tremendous chaotic evacuation out of New York City. So Goshen, New York, up here someplace, with a population of about 4,500 people, would find itself off the thruway exit, greeting 50, 75, 100,000 terrified, sick, potentially injured, potentially radioactive New Yorkers. There's been virtually zero planning for this chaotic evacuation out of any city that's been hit by a nuclear weapon. Third barrier is systemic political paralysis, and there is nobody in Washington that's responsible for nuclear response planning. There are a lot of people who work in it. There's nobody responsible for it. There's nobody who's accountable for anything to do with this, although there's thousands of people working on it. And that's a problem. There's 110 congressional committees and subcommittees that deal with some piece of Homeland Security or disaster preparedness. They do not speak to each other. They do not relinquish power, and they create silos of funding that infect all the federal agencies and then in turn all the state agencies. So even the possibility of coordination and authority is zero. There's nobody in the White House that controls the people in the various agencies that work on this. Let me just come back to this. Where's that? People, I mean, you saw when I asked you to raise your hand, I don't need to dwell on this, so nobody's really prepared. So I want to conclude with this point, really, which is, what are the lessons that we have learned from this series of events? And this is just a few of the things that we're all familiar with. And each one of these should have been learning opportunities so that we are more prepared for whatever it is the next time. And almost none of the lessons that should have come out of these events have actually been absorbed. So we're still fooling around with how we're going to do biosurveillance, means technology in places like post offices and train stations where we can early detect a biological agent that's there, still rudimentary, still not solved. The interoperability of radios, that was a problem, killing several hundred firefighters in New York on 9/11. The technologies there are still not implemented, all these years later. Smallpox, a whole other story, which is, we had a, probably don't remember, the summer of 2002, there was a plan by the government to inoculate the country against smallpox because we were afraid that the Iraqis would send smallpox-infected agents here to create an epidemic and so forth. But TNTC, about the lessons from Katrina, if you're looking at a slide in a urinalysis, let's say, you want to know, are there a lot of white cells indicating an infection? If there's so many there that's, you can't even count them, you say too numerous to count, TNTC. So the reference here is that there are so many lessons not learned out of Katrina that I would have to spend another couple hours here, and he won't let me. And Haiti, I'm not going to even dwell on that. So the question, these things which are often referred to as wake-up calls, do in fact prompt us to do things. We'll create a Department of Homeland Security, we'll spend a little money, and then we become complacent, and we forget about it, and we don't absorb the lessons. And so, although it's called a wake-up call, they're really more like snooze alarms. We get aroused, we kind of, whatever we do, we shake ourselves off, we hit the button, and we drift back to sleep. Everybody okay? Good luck to you. I'm going back to my shelter. You wouldn't mind.
Hello, everyone. I'm here from Sensible Cities Lab, which is a research lab at MIT. We're a fairly small lab. We're comprised of about 30 people right now. Our researchers come from various disciplines in computer science, engineering, graphic design, architecture. What we do is we use technologies that are often pioneered at MIT, and we look at cities across the globe that are having current problems, and we try to figure out ways we can use the technologies developed at MIT to help solve some of these problems. We often bring in big industry leaders like Cisco, IBM, and Intel to address some of these issues. But first I want to talk about cities and where they're headed. Is that the right one? That's all right, okay. Let me try this. Yep, okay. So in 1990, in the late 1990s, when the internet was becoming more ubiquitous, it was becoming more widely available to the public, a lot of technology writers and technologists predicted the death of cities. So, actually, okay, I'll keep using this. This is a quote from George Gilder. He's the founder of the Discovery Institute, and he's a technology writer. He said, "We're headed towards the death of cities. They're leftover baggage from the industrial era." A lot of people thought at the time that because digital spaces were becoming more widespread and more complex, that physical spaces would cease to have an importance that they once held in our lives. Well, we found this is not true at all, actually. At the beginning of the 21st century, we found that for the first time ever, there was a momentous but invisible shift where half the world's population now live in urban areas, and that number is only expected to increase over the next 10, 15, 30 to 50 years. So at MIT, we're trying to figure out, what does this mean? What does this mean for architecture, for urban planning, for engineering? How can we use the technologies that we're working on to improve the places where we live, work, and play? How can we embed networks and sensors in a very sort of seamless way to improve the quality of life across the board? We're looking also very specifically at environmental issues, which is what I'm going to talk about today, environmentally related problems that we're trying to solve. So I'm going to talk today specifically about two projects that our lab is working on. We're working on several in the last 6 years since our lab was developed. I think we've worked on over 30 different projects. These are just the most relevant. So Sensible Cities, we're exploring urban futures by developing technologically driven projects to solve some of today's most pressing environmental issues. So this is Trash Track. This was one of our most famous projects. It was widely covered at the time by BBC, Wired Magazine, the Boston Globe. And what we tried to do is we took this idea of smart dust. Smart dust, I'm not sure if you know, but it's nanotechnology. They're small microsensors that can communicate wirelessly with each other. It's still an idea, but we wanted to take this idea, how can we have little bits of microinformation floating in the environment that can communicate with each other and communicate back to us and tell us about the ambient environment. We thought about this and we wanted to apply it to a real-world problem or real-world challenge. And one of those problems is garbage. Garbage is becoming an increasingly important issue, especially in terms of the environment. I don't know if any of you have read about the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, which is located between California and Hawaii, but it's a floating mass of trash that's over twice the size of Texas. Researchers have predicted, yeah, it's pretty shocking. Researchers have predicted that they estimate that there are 5 total garbage patches. They collect in swirling currents in the world's oceans. So we've focused specifically on land-based trash, but you can see from this visualization, from this picture, that it's a huge and it's a growing problem. So one of the problems is that we know so much about the supply chain, but we know so little about the removal chain. If you take a standard computer, for example, you can break down the individual parts and find out where each component came from. This is something we did with a MacBook Pro. We had staff at the Media Lab take apart a computer, and using the tracking numbers, they could find out where different pieces were, where they came from all over the world, where it was shipped, where it was put together. And we sort of have a sense that these things are being disposed of properly, but we often know that they're not, especially with regard to electronic waste. Computers, TV monitors are often disposed. They're shipped overseas on big container ships, and they're dumped in third world countries like India and Pakistan, where they're not properly treated at all. You can see that from the picture here. So what our idea was, we wanted to embed wireless devices into trash. That was going to be step one. We wanted them to be sort of invisible, so that if someone came across the trash, they wouldn't realize what was inside of it. We had traceable garbage in the urban environment. That was sort of the idea. We would be able to follow it, but the average beholder wouldn't know where it was going. Waste management would come by and would collect the material. It would be transported, and it could be taken to any number of places. It could be shipped, it could be dumped, it could be incinerated, maybe recycled. And number 6 sort of illustrates what we were trying to get at. Where do these things actually end up? We had no idea. And one thing I should say here, the tags that we developed were all monitored so that the level of toxins in them was safe to be put into a landfill or to be incinerated. It was below the US governmental regulations. So this is one of the first trash tags that we developed. It relied on GSM technology. It was able to communicate to the nearest cell phone tower so we could have sort of a rough estimate of where it was located. These are a series of the tags. We sealed them in plastic and we numbered each one. This project was done in partnership with Waste Management, and eventually was done in partnership with Qualcomm. So you see the little phone-like material in this person's hand, that's actually a trash tag. It works very similarly to a cell phone. It sends out text messages to us based on its location. So it can't make phone calls, but it can send us messages so we know exactly where it is at a given time. If it's not moving for a certain amount of time, it's programmed at certain intervals every 2 to 3 hours to tell us its location. So what, pardon? The period of time that we could use them. These had a lifespan of about 3 months, and then the batteries died off. So these are the tags wrapped in sort of a foam material, so they were water resistant, but they weren't waterproof. What we did is we partnered with the city of Seattle. Seattle has some of the most innovative and progressive recycling programs in the country. So we partnered with them. This is a photo taken outside the Seattle Public Library. We had 500 volunteers from Seattle volunteer to have their trash tagged. We created a wish list, so we wanted items that were not just household items, but we wanted electronic waste. We wanted to make sure that we had a variety. So you can see here Jennifer Dunham, who's one of our researchers and an architecture student in our lab. She is tagging some trash brought by some volunteers. This is Asaf Biederman. He is the associate director of our lab. He's cutting open a teddy bear to put inside one of the tags. Here's some more pictures of things. So we had everything from television sets to motor oil containers to soup bowls. And what you notice in most of these pictures is that you can't actually see the tag. As I mentioned before, that was intentional. We wanted them to be picked up by Waste Management and not noticed as they went through the waste removal stream. This is a test run we did in Cambridge. So the dots that you see, that is the place where the trash originated from, and the lines going out is where the trash traveled over several hours. Okay. We also partnered up with Google so that all of the volunteers had an individual number that they could go in and enter online so they could follow their piece or pieces of trash individually to see where it ended up. So here's an example. This is a yogurt container. This was actually done in Seattle, and you can see that in 3 days it's traveled around 35 miles. Starts at the top. All the dots that you see along the way indicate points where the object was stationary. The larger the dot, the longer it was stationary. So, and this is some initial data that our researchers have just collected. We're just now going through, this project was launched last year, and we're just now able to analyze all the data. if you take photos of this, please don't release this. We're working on a paper right now, actually, and we're still in contract with Waste Management. We have a video visualization that I can't show, but this is just a very close-up picture of the city of Seattle. You can see different traces. I think this is after only a couple hours. But what you end up seeing after several days and several weeks is that some of these materials travel all the way across the country, sometimes as far as Washington, D.C. or Florida. What we found out is that things that are most likely to stay close to the source are things that are easy to recycle, like paper, plastics, aluminum, because most cities have proper recycling facilities for those. The items that traveled the farthest were electronic waste, because it wasn't economically efficient often for cities to have their own facilities. It was much easier for them to ship them all the way across the country, even though the environmental footprint might have been much greater. Okay, so that was Trash Track. We'll have a paper forthcoming hopefully in the next couple months. So Sea-Swarm is a project that we did this summer. It says Venice 2010 because we were invited by the Biennale in Venice to present a vision for life in 2050 using nanotechnology. So how will we live our lives in 2050? How will nanotechnology improve the way we live? So we thought of this idea, and obviously this summer one of the big issues on our minds was the oil spill in the Gulf. We did some background research and found out that over 800 skimmers were deployed to clean up just the surface oil from the spill. There were lots of different types of skimmers. Most of them needed some form of human intervention. Due to difficulty of scalability and operation, only 3% of all surface oil was actually collected to date. And that's a very generous estimate. Some estimates are as low as 1%. So we are also working with a professor at MIT called Francesco Stolacci. He has recently developed, and he's in the process of patenting, a nanofabric. It's a nanotechnology that's able to selectively absorb oil from water. So it's hydrophobic. You can put the material in water and it will only absorb oils. You can see on the lower right-hand side there's a layer of gasoline, and the fabric is put into the water. It comes back out completely dry. It won't absorb any water. The article discussing this fabric is mentioned in Nature Nanotechnology. So here's a close-up of the fabric. It looks and feels like paper, so it's a very, very fine mesh. One of the exciting things about this material, as well as it's able to absorb up to 20 times its weight in oil, and we have a constant removal process. So once it's burned, if the material is burned off from the mesh fabric, it can be used over and over and over again. So we took this idea and we thought, what if we could design a fleet of small, autonomous, scalable robots that could utilize this nanofabric to clean up future oil spills? This is a breakdown of what the vehicle would look like. We're currently calling it Sea-Swarm. It's inspired by a catamaran. So there's a yellow head at the top that sort of stabilizes it. In the front, you see a conveyor belt. It's covered by the thin nanofabric, and as it moves through the head heats up the fabric to an extent where the oil is either burned off or it's collected, and then the fabric is able to be used over and over again. We made the belt flexible, so it's able to conform to the shape of the water. It's flip resistant in this way. It's very flexible. These are the options I meant before. So it has several options. We can either burn off the oil. This is one of the options we're looking to. We can bag it in plastic bags and leave a tracking tag so that larger ships would be able to come by and pick it up. Or we might be able to shed the oil and store it on site in the head. That would obviously involve scaling up this prototype. The prototype we've developed right now is about 2 meters by 5 meters, so it's a half-scale prototype. We would need to make it much bigger. So the way that it works is it works on swarm behavior using Wi-Fi. These units are able to communicate to each other. They're autonomous. They use a sensing system. There's no human intervention necessary or involved in any way, so they would be able to communicate with each other and be able to work completely autonomously. This is the first generation prototype that we tested at MIT. You can see it's in one of the water tanks we have here at the lab. So this is built just using materials that we got at a local hardware store and a Walmart. I think we put this together in a couple weeks just to be able to see if the conveyor belt would work, if it could propel itself, if it could control its movement. This is a second generation prototype. You can see the head is much bigger. The plastic piece in the middle is designed to catch the conveyor belt as it moves through. This is the final version, and this is the version that we showed at the Venice Biennale. You can see in the front the nano fabric covered conveyor belt that moves through. Also, one thing I should mention is the way that it's powered is through photovoltaics. So on the top of the head it has a series of photovoltaic cells that'll be able to keep it running for several months. Our researchers have done some estimates, and they believe that if we had 5,000 to 10,000 of these vehicles working 24/7 for several months, we would be able to clean up oil spill the size of the Gulf. We tested it in the Charles River a few weeks ago. It works. We've gotten a lot of press for this. It's been doing really well. Right now, we're focusing most of our efforts on entering it into the Wendy Schmidt Oil Prize. It's a $1.4 million X Prize for anyone who can come up with a new technology that'll more quickly and efficiently address future oil spills. To date, we haven't had a chance to test it in the Gulf. We're assembling a new team of engineers that'll hopefully be able to go there within the next couple months to actually test this out. It's only had one actual run in the water so far. And so that's it. These are some of our projects.
Can we have the lights on? I don't have a PowerPoint presentation today. I know, can you believe it? Yeah. A couple of years ago, I was at a conference, and a colleague of mine asked me if I was going to be using PowerPoint, and I said no, I was going to be PowerPointless. And at the time, I had not anticipated all the different meanings of that, one of them being that I was going without PowerPoint, the other one being that PowerPoint perhaps encourages sometimes, especially among my students, a certain pointless kind of presentation culture. And the third one being that I was going to have no point. And so hopefully I had a point that day, and hopefully I have a point today too, even though I don't have slides. But it's a pleasure and an honor to be here today. And before I begin, I'd like to thank Dr. Sasson for the invitation to join what's proven to be an important conference on a topic of pressing global concern. My own contribution to the day's deliberations concerns the role of municipalities and transnational municipal networks in global climate governance. The matter of cities and climate change concerns not only what we might call the centripetal aspect of local global relations, to borrow a physics-based metaphor both from Dr. Sasson and from Arjun Appadurai, but also the centrifugal aspect of those relations. That is, it concerns not only those emergent conditions of the urban landscape shaped by global environmental change and efforts to govern the same. It also concerns the potential for urban actors from formally authoritative municipalities to informally authoritative actors in the urban landscape to shape both the global environment and principles and practices by which we govern global environmental change. In other words, when considering the relationship between cities and the global environment, we need to consider, to stick with the physics metaphor here, both what the world spins into cities and what cities spin into the world. The question before me is how to characterize primarily the centrifugal role of transnational municipal networks in climate governance. How might we best frame and compare the formation and actions of various transnational municipal networks and their contributions to global climate governance? I propose that the roles of transnational municipal networks become clearer when we frame them as involved in either governance-oriented technical entrepreneurship or politics-oriented norm entrepreneurship. The former, I'll suggest, corresponds to what we might call normal environmental politics, while the latter corresponds to what we might call post-normal environmental politics. This post-normal expression of environmental politics by municipalities and transnational municipal networks has the potential to begin, as Dr. Sasson has put it, to change the orientation or valence of cities as systems, the capabilities of which have significant extraterritorial reach. For the sake of illustrating this point, and because transnational municipal networks are only now beginning to devote attention to adaptation, I will focus on the matter of transnational municipal networks and climate change mitigation. Specifically, I'll speak of emissions reduction targets or strategies rather than strategies for greenhouse gas sequestration. Much of the literature on transnational municipal climate governance networks concerns either their effectiveness or the reasons that municipalities join these networks. Regarding the former, many scholars find both municipalities and transnational municipal networks unlikely to be especially effective actors in climate stabilization. While municipalities possess not inconsiderable policy and planning instruments that can contribute to local emissions reductions, the mobility of producers and consumers, their capacities to move beyond the jurisdictions of these municipalities, means that federal or at least coordinated action would be required in order to make globally meaningful emissions reductions. Transnational municipal network membership is not broad enough to achieve this level of coordination yet. Regarding the rationale for municipal membership, reasons that cities join these networks range from the exceptional vulnerability of cities, we've heard about that today, to some projected effects of climate change, to the presence of progressive governance regimes in some cities. These would be Greg's crusaders, if there are any, to eco-branding or greenwashing, perhaps Greg's cynics. Unfortunately, none of this excellent research tells us what role these networks might play in a governance environment that, due to the stunted development of mega multilateral efforts at climate stabilization, is increasingly characterized by multi-centric and multi-level efforts that include what Matthew Hoffman has called climate governance experiments. In a forthcoming book from Oxford University Press, Hoffman argues that actors from the individual to the organizational level have been engaging in climate governance characterized by voluntary membership, binding agreement to undertake certain actions, and market orientation. Much of what goes under the name of transnational municipal networks is consistent with Hoffman's climate experiment idea. The largest and most prominent transnational municipal networks participating in climate governance could fairly be characterized in this fashion. No such network is bigger than the International Council for Local Environmental Initiatives Cities for Climate Protection program. ICLEI itself boasts more than 1,000 member municipalities in over 60 countries, and the Climate Protection Program has hundreds of municipal members that have signed on to ICLEI's 5-milestone program for baselining greenhouse gas emissions, developing a climate change action plan, assessing the implementation of those plans, and finally taking steps to reduce emissions. ICLEI's sheer size and organization make it a formidable actor in multi-level climate governance. It was the first network of local governments to become an accredited observer organization at the UNFCCC. It is a founding partner in the World Climate Summit and has been instrumental in the development of the Carbon Cities Climate Registry, an institution of accountability for municipalities that pledge to undertake the type of program that CCP has promoted. ICLEI CCP not only organizes urban climate stabilization efforts, but it diffuses best practices for climate stabilization across cities, and if evidence of vertical policy diffusion is to be believed, from cities to state and national levels of governance. Another high-profile municipal network is the C40 Large Cities Climate Leadership Group, a group of the world's leading cities committed to tackling climate change. C40 is primarily a network of municipalities that share information about urban policy initiatives, particularly fitting to large cities that seek to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. C40 cities have pledged in particular to undertake policies and alliances to accelerate the uptake of climate-friendly technologies and influence the marketplace in 8 key areas: buildings, energy, lighting, ports, renewable energy, transport, waste, and water. What is it that networks such as ICLEI, CCP, and C40 are up to then? What are they diffusing into the domain of global climate governance? Both organizations are diffusing best practices and information, 2 keys to technical entrepreneurship. As technical entrepreneurs, both ICLEI CCP and C40 are legitimizing forces of and in global environmental governance, pioneering problem-solving activities in which actors are among the first to engage a particular environmental challenge or to engage it with unique methods, but in any case to engage that challenge within the bounds of established and widely accepted norms and values. One might describe these efforts at technical entrepreneurship as normal environmental politics, to borrow a concept from Thomas Kuhn. CCP and C40 are involved in problem-solving or puzzle-solving activities. The practice of normal environmental politics is one that pursues climate stability in the context of political economic stability, serving to legitimize the norms and values undergirding the extant system of climate governance, even while admitting that that system suffers from technical failures. The failure to undertake serious and effective climate stabilization efforts at the national and multilateral levels is regarded as a puzzle to be solved within the bounds of prevailing political and economic theories and hypotheses. There is, however, an alternative. Sticking with Kuhn momentarily, if some municipalities and transnational municipal networks are involved in normal environmental politics, then others may be involved in what we could call post-normal environmental politics. Rather than seeing climate change and the inability to establish a global regime for the stabilization of climate as mere puzzles in an otherwise robust paradigm for global environmental governance, some might see climate change and the inability to establish a global regime for the stabilization of climate as anomalies that reveal serious flaws in the constellation of values, principles, and norms that constitute our paradigm of global environmental governance. Post-normal climate politics would call into question the values, principles, and norms that constitute this paradigm and engage in the search for climate stabilization solutions founded upon or consistent with alternative values, principles, and norms. It is a relatively straightforward task to imagine what such an effort might look like, calling into question the signal value of market-based environmental governance, namely efficiency. Not calling it into question because it is one foundation of market-based environmental governance, but because it is an under-examined and under-deliberated norm and serves as part of the architecture of the global environmental governance paradigm that has failed to articulate a regime for climate stability. Post-normal environmental politics would evidence a sort of fishing around for suitable norms upon which to base a more effective approach to climate stabilization. Transnational municipal networks participating in such an endeavor would express these norms in ways that shape the outcomes of their work. At least one transnational municipal network proves to be involved in post-normal environmental politics. The International Solar Cities Initiative, or ISCI, is an organization that hosts biennial solar city congresses for cities committed to an equitable and sustainable climate stability solution. It was founded in 2003 when 19 mayors signed the Daegu Declaration at the first Solar Cities Congress in Daegu, South Korea. The Daegu Declaration elevates the norms of sustainability and equity over the norm of efficiency, calling for cities to pledge to meet the annual per capita emissions goal of 3.3 tons of CO2 and equivalent greenhouse gases, which was at the time regarded by some as an emissions rate that might stabilize atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases at sustainable levels. The per capita aspect of this target, coupled with ISCI's focus on the municipal scale, expresses and privileges the norm of equity, a norm that is largely absent from the mainstream of global climate governance deliberations, or at least not operationalized in this particular fashion. In the first place, per capita expressions of emissions targets at any scale below the global scale ensure an equity between, even if not within, different nations or communities. That is, the higher the scale for which the target is expressed, the greater the potential for disparities and inequities. Hypothetically, and at the extreme, in a world of 7 billion people, 23 billion tons per year could be emitted by one person, while 100 million tons could be emitted collectively by all 6,999,999,999 people. By expressing this cap as a target at the national scale, though, we immediately multiply the minimum level of equity by multiple orders of magnitude, specifically 203, the number of sovereign nation states worldwide. We also increase the proximity of those who emit the most gases to those who emit the least. By expressing this cap as a target at the municipal scale, we decrease inequality thousands of times over, further increasing minimum levels of equity by multiple orders of magnitude, while further increasing the proximity of those who emit the most gases to those who emit the least, taking advantage of what Dr. Sossin has called the production of presence in cities. This is a far cry from the singular focus on the efficient distribution of scarce resources as the norming norm of global environmental governance. That is, the norm that norms all other norms. The relationship between urban and global environmental politics is evidently mutually constitutive. Industrial and post-industrial urban metabolisms shape the global environment in particular ways, aside from which global climate governance would be a moot issue. On the other hand, the politics of this hitherto largely multilateral environmental governance issue is being instantiated both within and between cities and transnational municipal networks. At the same time, those cities and municipal networks shape global climate politics. In the case of networks participating in normal environmental politics, networks like ICLEI CCP or C40, they are diffusing best practices both horizontally across cities and vertically to actors at other scales. In the case of networks participating in post-normal environmental politics, they are diffusing values, principles, and norms. In other words, transnational municipal networks may play the role of norm entrepreneur in global environmental politics. Specifically, they may introduce or articulate norms that are subversive in the sense that Cardinal Arns of Sao Paulo uses the word. To subvert, he says, means to turn a situation round and look at it from the other side. That is, the side of the people who have to die so that the system can go on. The International Solar Cities Initiative, like some other actors in global climate governance, for example, the Alliance of Small Island States and others whose lives and livelihoods are at stake, understands and articulates the climate governance imperative and the role of cities in climate governance as an issue of environmental justice, of the inequitable distribution of environmental risk, and the lack of participation in determining environmental quality. Let me be clear about what I'm not saying. I'm not saying that transnational municipal networks will necessarily introduce or articulate norms that will eventually be operationalized in mainstream global climate governance. The eventual adoption and operationalization of norms advanced is not the measure of a norm entrepreneur. Still, even norms that are not adopted and operationalized may play an important role in governance. The introduction and articulation of even marginal norms may shape the ways in which more mainstream norms are operationalized. In this way, even if cities and transnational municipal networks are not especially effective at or key actors in the achievement of climate stabilization, they may find themselves effective in shaping the way we govern climate change. The most important role of transnational municipal networks may, in fact, be that of norm entrepreneur in the mode of post-normal environmental politics. Thank you.
All right, I'm going to ask, please do not turn off the lights. Everybody can see, and it just reinforces the idea that it's a meat locker in here. So please. So I'm going to, go next to be the person who has to be PowerPoint-less, or maybe I'm being PowerPointed. So you judge by how my talk goes. Okay, so hi, I'm Dana Fisher, and I am here to talk about environmental activism in the urban ecosystem. Let me just say that the talk is based on preliminary findings from 2 different projects I'm working on that are funded by the National Science Foundation. And I'm calling from pieces that are from different articles as well as a piece that's forthcoming in the Encyclopedia of Globalization. So if anybody's interested in something I talk about today, feel free to ask me because I have a number of papers that I'm speaking from. So we did it like this, right? Okay, so what is environmental activism? Here is a definition that I put together. This is from my piece in the Encyclopedia of Globalization. It is defined as collective social action that is focused on issues related to the natural environment. And it's interesting, when I was given the task of writing this piece, I spoke with my colleague Sid Taro, and I said to him, how have you guys defined it? And he says, I don't know. Come up with something good. So hopefully you'll feel that that is a good definition. Nonetheless, it's a working definition. And one of the things that I think is very important here is to make this broad enough that it includes a diversity of actors. So we have civil society working by themselves as civil society actors, grassroots activists, but then we also have these hybrid formations of groups working with businesses and government elites in ways that have become increasingly prevalent within different types of regimes and different types of environmental issues. And such action can be in support of the protection of environmental goods, and we can think about protecting a coral reef or a virgin forest, but they also can be in opposition, so in protest of the distribution of environmental bads. So good examples of this would be protesting toxic waste that is being released during industrial processes, or even the siting of garbage landfills in specific communities. The important thing here, as you can see in my little arrow, is that there are two sides. There's this continuum here, and there are a range of tactics and a range of targets that come out of environmental activism. And based on what the targets and tactics are, environmental activism has different faces. And in a lot of cases, increasingly, the environmental activism targets actors at multiple scales of governance simultaneously. And what I'm going to do, in my work, I look at this in multiple types of environmental issues. But here today, what I'm going to do is provide two examples that show that, first of all, there's a diversity of ways that environmental activism takes place. But second of all, to show that environmental activism, even though there are multiple scales at which it takes place, it is extremely geographically situated. And I'll hopefully prove that to you today. So I'm going to present two examples of environmental activism that I wouldn't say are on the extreme points with regard to this arrow, but definitely fall on the two sides of the arrow. And the first one is going to be looking at a relatively supportive case of environmental activities, specifically here in New York City in relation to the sustainability plan in New York City. And then the second one involves much more oppositional tactics and targets and activities having to do with the climate change regime in Copenhagen during the climate change negotiations last winter. So COP15 for all of you who do work on climate. So case one, start right here in New York City. Here's New York City. It's a much nicer looking day on all these pictures than it is today. So this work comes out of the work I've been doing with the U.S. Forest Service for a number of years. And it's part of our Stewardship Mapping and Assessment Project, or what we like to call StewMap. And we've been working on the project since 2005. And what this project started with was a survey of all civic groups doing stewardship in New York City. So within the bounds of New York City. And I should just tell you how we define stewardship so that there are no questions here. It is defined as anybody or any group, and it has to be a group, so it has to be more than one person, that engages in a component of stewardship as defined as conserving, managing, monitoring, advocating for, and educating friends, neighbors, and representatives about the local environments, and this includes water, land, air, waste, toxics, and energy uses. As you may understand here, this is an extremely broad way of thinking about stewardship or environmental activism. And the point here is that there are lots of people and organizations that do work having to do with the environment that wouldn't self-identify as environmental activists, but they're still doing work that would fall into my definition of, let's see, I should have that memorized, collective social action focused on issues related to the natural environment. So to begin with, let me give you a map. Here's an organizational density map of the organizations that responded to our survey. So the N is 555 groups in New York City. It comes out of a survey of 2,793 groups, so we have a response rate of about 20%, which is consistent, but not as good as we would have loved. But you get a sense here of how it plays out across the 5 boroughs. Next, here's a response to how do they steward? So how do they actually do stuff with regard to the environment? So respondents were allowed to check all that apply here, and the percentages are based on those who answered these questions. So you see, conservation is the most dominant. Then we go down to education, advocating, managing, and then monitoring falls down below. This next diagram shows you where they steward. So this builds off of earlier work on an exhaustive way that urban stewards may participate in the kinds of areas and site types where they may actually take care of the environment. So we run the gamut from parks all the way down to dog runs. And basically, groups reported working on all different types of sites around New York City. The most common sites were parks, community gardens, and street trees. So those are the trees that line the streets, not the trees that are in the parks. And the least common sites were stewardship for rooftops, which may be becoming much more popular right now because there's a big green roof movement here in New York City, and dog runs, which, mostly involves scooping poop, so a lot of people don't choose to do that. I'm just being honest here, right? Okay, one of the other things that we've been doing with this project and with these data are looking at the connections among the stewards. Now, I realize that this is probably completely illegible, but what I wanted you to do is get a sense of the map of the connections among the stewards. So we asked the groups how they connect with one another and with whom they connect. And this is everybody, all of the civic groups, and it doesn't talk about how they connect with businesses or government groups or government agencies, but we do have that as well. And here's what I want you to take away from this very hard to read map. The first thing is that there's a big collection and agglomeration of isolates in the middle, groups that really aren't connected to much at all. And they're relatively disconnected, and they tend to be, they tend to be the smaller groups. And then on the outside, we have the ring of connected groups. And the size here represents the number of groups that mentioned them, right? So we have probably the most popular here is the Green Gorillas. And I'll give you one more, the Brooklyn Botanical Garden, right up there. So you get a sense. And one of the things that's interesting, and if I had more time to talk, I'd tell you about this, is that the groups tend to glom together with groups that focus on the same types of environmental issues, right? So the water groups are with the water groups, and the land groups tend to be connected to the land groups, and we're digging much more into these data now, so that's what I can tell you at this point, but stay tuned if you're interested. So we're currently looking into the characteristics of the network broadly, as well as the hybrid arrangements, which I'm very interested in terms of how the groups are working with businesses as well as government actors. And then we're also doing an organizational history of the nodes, and that's part of the work that I'm doing with the Ultra X project that I lead here in New York City. So that gives you a little sense of what's going on here in New York City. Here's a very, very different case, but I'm going to argue is certainly geographically situated. This is the case of the climate movement. Now, the climate movement can be discussed in all different ways. It's a global movement. It's connected between transnational actors. Some would argue, actually, that the groups that you were talking about, these municipalities, are actually part of the climate movement. But we'll just put them aside for now and just say that I'm talking about the actors who were involved specifically in climate activism around the climate negotiations in Copenhagen in December 2009. That was during the COP15 negotiations. And here are some pictures, some of which I took, the blurry ones, and some of which I didn't take, like this one. I wasn't that close to the guy beating up the protester. And what I think is very important to note here is that there were many different ways of doing activism in Copenhagen. Okay, we've got outside the negotiations, and outside the negotiations involved marching. This is the huge march. It involved 80,000 people. It also involved a lot of billy clubs and a little bit of tear gas. And then there was activism taking place inside the negotiations, and that's where there were a lot of NGO observers and researchers presenting their work, trying to speak to the regime more broadly. And then you have, the carolers. Any of us who have actually been to the climate negotiations know you always have the carolers, and they sing these wonderful songs that have been rewritten to be about destroying the planet. And eventually the panda shows up. Or no, sorry, the koala. The panda shows up too. I had another picture of a panda, but this is the koala. And he sits there and, and that's environmental activism, right? So both of these kinds of tactics were used in Copenhagen, and they're used in all of the climate, all of the times that climate activism takes place around the meetings of the climate regime. But what I think is kind of interesting about what happened in Copenhagen is that it was extremely elevated. Okay, so this is just a table that shows you civil society participation inside the negotiations, starting with COP6, the negotiations where the Kyoto Protocol was supposed to be finished. And we can talk at length about that, but just to give you a sense of participation, right? So you can see here that the total number of NGO observers from 2000 to 2009 went from, 3,500 people to 20,611 people, right? Within the negotiations, just going in to do stuff. And in a lot of ways, I think this is a proxy for the type of, the level of environmental activism that was taking place within the hall. Now, there's a whole discussion about what happened in the Bella Center in the second half of the negotiations that I'll just table, but if anybody's interested, I have a paper on it. I'd be happy to share with you. But outside at the same time, there was this huge, first of all, there was a huge day of action that took place where there were 80,000 people who protested, and that was connected to a global day of action that coordinated actions in 108 countries. So let me give you a sense of environmental activism outside. So this is based on a random survey of protesters that I did with a bunch of students during the demonstration and march in Copenhagen on a big Saturday in between the 2 weeks of negotiation. And it's just, a diagram to show you where everybody came from. And I'm just starting to play with these data now, so this is probably the best that I was able to show you here. But basically what you can see here is that people came from all over, although we got a lot of Europe, which is not surprising because if you're going to travel somewhere to participate in activism, it frequently ends up that you go relatively close to home. But we had a nice diversity of people sampled in the survey. And Denmark represented the largest turnout. And there were unions there. Having been in the crowd, freezing my fingers off, I can tell you that Denmark had the largest number of people. They had unions out. They had groups specifically from Copenhagen. They had moms out with their families who wanted to get their kids out to show them what activism was all about. So it was a really interesting diversity of people. One of the other things that we did is I worked with a computer scientist at Rutgers, and we kept track of tweets taking place around the climate activism in Copenhagen. So this is actually, these are newly analyzed data. Is Israel in the crowd? He said he was coming. All right, so I had this wonderful student who I'm going to give my props to who analyzed these data. We had 1,049 tweets that took place around specifically talking about activism and the police in Copenhagen during the 2-week period that was the negotiations. And what we did is we coded them doing a content analysis to look at what people were talking about. Because one of the things that happened is there was all this direct action taking place. And so the police were trying to infiltrate. So they would go to the bars and the hostels where the activists were staying and try to shut them down so they couldn't come out and storm the Bella Center, which was what their goal was. And their aim was on the Wednesday of the beginning of the ministerial meeting, they would shut down the negotiations. So I was very interested in how tweeting was related to what was happening in the street. So what you see here is that the activists were using Twitter, right? So they tweeted a lot about police activity. But one thing that I thought was very interesting is I expected that a lot of the tweets would be about planning to meet places. So, we're going to go throw rocks at this, this location, join us. And it ends up that you can barely see there's this little mauve plum band that's in there that is the planning. But most of it was about reporting and looking at how people were just reporting on activities that were taking place. So I think this is, an interesting way of thinking about how activists, all these people talk about how activists are using the internet and new technologies, and here's an opportunity to start thinking about a time when they really had to use it because people were getting locked up and jailed. And all of a sudden, this was a wonderful tool for them for coordinating and identifying things like the police have surrounded the bar. Don't come here for our meeting. But these were the kinds of things that people were tweeting about. So this gives you a sense of how it happened. And what I think is really interesting is this is the day of action. This is the day they tried to shut down the negotiations, and lo and behold, as one might expect, that's when most tweeting happened. All right, so moving on. Success and failure of environmental activism in Copenhagen. So this is based on a paper I published in Global Environmental Politics, which talks about what I call the merging of movements. So we have historically this traditional movement, this climate movement of environmental groups and NGO observers that try to participate and influence what's going on within the negotiations. And those include the carolers and the koala bears and the pandas, and you always have the vegans there, and they hand out weird rotten sandwiches with meat in them and tasteful things like that. At the same time, you also had this climate justice movement that wanted to use direct action and work outside the negotiations. And for the first time, you had people coming specifically to the negotiations with no interest whatsoever in getting in, except for to shut down what was happening inside. And you had a little bit of that taking place in earlier negotiations, but not to the same degree. And what I say in the paper is that specifically this merging of movements led to civil society being left out in the cold. And I mean this actually quite literally, because those of us who were there, and all researchers count as civil society, by the way, because we're not members of state delegations, we're standing out in the cold. I stood out in the cold for 8 hours the last day I went into the negotiations because the registration lines were so long, and they were basically trying to keep people out because they didn't want there to be activism taking place inside. And they started to worry for the government representatives who were inside. The other thing that this did is it really increased the visibility of what was happening, and also, I would argue, led to a different type of activism that will take place at climate negotiations in the future. It's kind of like what we've seen for the WTO, for the World Bank, for what happens in Davos. So we'll see if that's true, and Cancun is coming. But I know Cancun does a really good job with security, so we'll see. So, in conclusion, here are my take-home messages. So first of all, environmental activism is very diverse and involves multiple actors who target all scales of governance through a variety of tactics, and some of them are more or less oppositional depending on what their targets are and their goals are. We need to understand better how different forms of environmental activism and the actors involved are related, and try to understand how they work together and how sometimes they don't work together. In addition to the more abstract understanding that this will help us to do, for those of us who write in, abstract sociological journals that you'll probably never read, there also will be very helpful for us to understand the effectiveness in civil society's role in policy-making processes better. And this isn't just at the multinational level, this is also at local scales of governance, where civil society actors engage in many different ways, and also, in many ways, that's where they really take care of the environment. They don't do a lot of taking care of the environment if they're flying to another country to participate in global activism. The real environmental activism, I would argue, takes place in places outside your front door and when you are constantly being involved in environmental management of some form. So thank you very much.
I would like to introduce our concluding speaker. He will be the last one. Amit Sriravava, if I pronounce that right, has been an activist and really an inventor of new strategies. I am a great admirer of the projects. Amit initiated the Climate Justice Initiative in 2000, which was the first ever program on climate justice, which redefined climate change from a human rights and environmental justice perspective. Today, he is the coordinator of India Resource Center and the director of Global Resistance. For the last 8 years, Amit has coordinated the international campaign to hold Coca-Cola accountable for mismanagement of water resources in India, and I think that is what you're going to talk a bit about, right? Come to the podium.
Thank you. And how's everybody doing? Good? All right. No PowerPoint here. This is a perspective from the community. And thank you, Saskia, for introducing me. As she mentioned, I'm the international campaigner for the international campaign to hold Coca-Cola accountable for water abuses in India. Some of you may know the Coca-Cola company has many different bottling plants all across India, and they have been challenged in a lot of different places in India for denying large sumbers of people, particularly farmers, particularly low-income folks, of water, because Coca-Cola is sucking so much water from under the ground that the water tables have fallen drastically. And consequently, the farmers and the people who live around Coca-Cola's bottling plants don't have access to water anymore, including water not only for farming, but including water for cooking, for drinking, for cleaning, for bathing, just your basic daily needs. And so there's been a tremendous campaign led by communities in India to challenge Coca-Cola's practices, not all across India, but definitely in areas where Coca-Cola has located its bottling plants in water-stressed areas. And some of them have had just absolutely tremendous results, which I will talk about. But before I get into that, I just wanted to frame sort of where we come from. And I've enjoyed the presentations today. It's been very, very useful for us. However, you know, I mean, one of the things that we would like to see more, and when I say we, I'm talking about communities in India, farming communities in India, is that as people here who have presented on you know, new emerging technologies, on how to deal with new crises or emerging crises or current crises, one of the things we all need to make sure we do is that we talk to each other, that the communities are very much included in this process. And this was brought up actually by our last two speakers. The whole notion of environmental justice or even climate justice is very much actually, it came about as a result of, you know, people doing environmental activism or climate activism, but, you know, having no connection whatsoever with the people who are being affected the most by environmental degradation or climate crisis. Unfortunately, that situation still holds true today. It has changed, it has improved. There is more communication with social movements around the world. But we need to do better. We need to do more in terms of you know, involving communities around the world, especially those communities who are most impacted by the climate crisis, for example, and environmental degradation, for example, especially when we are proposing or advocating for new ideas on how to deal with these situations. And this has been one of our biggest criticisms of the US environmental movement and the climate movement for that matter, which is one of the reasons we also say that the climate movement or the environmental movement in the United States has failed in many ways because they have not been able to engage at the grassroots level very, very effectively. In fact, I think all of us know it, you know, the BP oil spill. It's not a spill, it's a gush, right? I mean, this is the biggest environmental disaster, right, in the United States. Well, where is the environmental movement? You know, the Congress just went into recess yesterday, and they have not even discussed, they have not even brought up, the Senate has not even considered any new legislation to sort of, you know, regulate these oil companies to make sure that something like this doesn't happen again. They're gone, and they're going to only come back after the elections in November, and then they're only going to meet for 2 weeks, and then they're going to go home again. Yeah? And many of us feel that this is the result, you know, this is the result of actually not having enough people at the grassroots who can let the policymakers know that if you don't act on this, that you're going to have to pay come election day, right? And I think that is something that we all need to keep in mind. For us, very much so, as we move forward in dealing with the emerging crises around cities, around farming, climate, has to do with corporations. We feel that there are certain actors in this global arena who have tremendous power, namely transnational corporations. And of course, there are some individual countries as well, such as the United States and the European Union bloc, who wield too much power in these negotiations, for example, that Dana was talking about, the Copenhagen. This is something that we are very much concerned about as far as India goes and how we will turn out. Essentially, what we're seeing is that regardless of what the government officials may say about how serious they are about dealing with the climate crisis in countries like India or China, at the end of the day, if you look at what they're doing, it's really business as usual. It's all about promoting, in the case of the United States, more corporate investment from the United States. It's about pushing a certain model, a certain kind of development, a certain kind of lifestyle, right, which we live here in the United States. But in fact, this is exactly the lifestyle that has led us to this climate crisis. And this is this lifestyle that is based primarily on more consumption. It's consume, consume, consume. And of course, the consumption chain is very many times unsustainable. And so it has led us to this point today where, you know, we are like, well, what are we going to do? You know, I mean, and you know, even Mr. Obama says, well, you know, in terms of the financial crisis, we need to consume our way out of the crisis, which we think is a completely wrong message. And it's not just about responsible consumption. It is about consumption, and it's about privatization. And by privatization, I mean, you know, and somebody had mentioned earlier today that in the city of, I think, one of the eco-cities in Korea, that it's about the control of data. Like, who controls that data is the one, you know, who you know, is in charge, right? And because they're making money out of it. And that, in fact, is what it's all about. It's about corporations and definitely some countries who are jostling for power. But power for what? It's about control. It's about having control so that anything that may happen, that they are the beneficiaries of that. And this is what we're very fearful of in India as we move forward, that a handful of companies, not just the United States, but from around the world, including from India, and a handful of governments are actually dictating our policies in India. And what's going to end up happening is we're going to start looking more and more like, in some parts of India, like the United States, which, you know, I don't know if you'd agree, but it's not necessarily a very good thing. You know, I mean, to have strip malls and these kinds of things all across the country, I think if there is anything the United States has taught us, and Europe, is which is the path not to go towards. Okay, and that is something that we need to learn from. So that was a long context, but I do want to talk about what we're doing with the Coca-Cola Company, because I think it's very illustrative of sort of where we're at and where we're headed, and why it's rather disastrous. The Coca-Cola Company, as you know, produces all their products, whether it's Coca-Cola itself or their orange drinks like Fanta, or bottled water like Dasani. And in India, they actually came to India in 1991. So relatively a new entry as far as, you know, the world goes, because most countries by 1991 had Coca-Cola, but India did not. And when they came in, I mean, what did Coca-Cola do? You know, they obviously looked around for places where they could manufacture their products in India. And they went about it two different ways. And this is typical of Coca-Cola. The first strategy that Coca-Cola used, and it uses all over the place, is that they looked at what already existed in terms of factories and companies that produce these beverages, right? And Indian people, we love sweet stuff. We have the highest diabetes rate in the world as well. And, you know, if you go to our shops, it's all about sweet, 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 you know? And so we actually had a very active and a very vibrant indigenous soft drink industry in India run by Indian companies. And one of the first things that Coca-Cola did was it bought those out. It bought out the largest of the Indian companies. And the second thing, of course, it did and continues to do is that it started to build new bottling plants in India. Now, what has happened, just to make a long story short, is, I mean, you know, when they build a factory, right? When they even identify a factory, I mean, one of the first things they look at is, of course, water, okay? Because when they came into India in 1991, even in 2000, even 10 years later, in 2001, it used to take Coca-Cola 9 liters of water to make 1 liter of Coca-Cola. Okay, so they would take this perfectly fine fresh water from under the ground, which is the primary way that they get all their water, they meet all their water needs in India. It's from the groundwater, from, you know, the water that sits in the aquifers under the ground. And they would put up these pumps, and as I say, you know, it took them 9 liters of water in 2001 to make 1 liter of Coca-Cola. The question that we asked, and should be asked, is, well, if it takes you 9 to make 1, what happens to the other 8, right? Which is something Coca-Cola does not like to talk about, because the 8 liters of water that does not go into the product is actually converted into wastewater. It is converted into polluted water, because they use the majority of the water for cleaning, for for cleaning the bottles, for cleaning the machines, and cleaning the floors. And they introduce these chemicals into it, and consequently they pollute the vast majority of the water. What was going on in India is that soon after they started their operations, their bottling plants in different parts of India, the people who live around them started to notice one thing, right? And I'm not talking about one place. I'm talking that this was sort of a pattern, that different communities in different parts of India, within a year or so, started to recognize that suddenly all their wells had started to go down or even run dry, okay? And that the hand water pumps that people use to meet their water needs would not work anymore. In other words, they would not bring out water anymore, okay? You have to understand, we're talking about India, where 70%, that's 70% of our population today still makes a living related to agriculture. It's a very agrarian society, okay? Secondly, we're talking about India, and that means that the majority of the population in India still today does not have piped drinking water, taps coming into their homes. Instead, the vast majority of people in India, even today, rely on the same groundwater resource that Coca-Cola came in, and actually subsequently Pepsi too, the same water resource that the people in India, most people in India use, is what Coca-Cola was tapping into. And so when Coca-Cola came into these communities, many times what happened was that they took so much water from under the ground that the water tables fell. In some places that we have documented, they fell about 30 feet in just 2 years. Now 30 feet, my friends, is not a small amount of drop, okay? 30 feet, 9.72 meters is one place we found. And there are other stories as well, horror stories. This is not, this company, as I said, its primary raw material is water. How much water does it take? It depends on the plant, it depends on the production capacity. In some parts of India, it was taking up to 1 million liters of water every day. Okay, so obviously, in areas where there's already, where the water tables are stressed because it's in a drought area, it's in a desert. Yes, my friends, Coca-Cola has built bottling plants in deserts in India, okay, where already people were having issues accessing water. And here comes this company saying, okay, yeah, we're going to build one. And so, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out what would happen next. So that was one thing, that people started to see their water resources dwindle as a result of Coca-Cola coming in. Now, the second thing was what happened was, what do you do when your wells run dry? Well, you dig deeper into the ground, right? So that you tap into, sometimes 30 feet deeper, and then you will tap into that depleted aquifer, the water table. And they did. And when they did, in some of the places, the water started flowing again, it started coming again, the hand water pump started working again. But immediately, almost immediately, it was the women in these areas who noticed that there was something different about this water. It tasted different. It was harder. You didn't take the soap off like it used to before. It cooked the lentils and the rice differently, like from before. It used to before they drilled even more. And many of us, including the government of India and independent agencies, got this water tested. And we found that this water was contaminated. And it was contaminated with what? It was contaminated with the same chemicals that Coca-Cola had used in these factories, right, in their factories for cleaning, okay? Because what Coca-Cola was doing, and still does to this day, is that all that wastewater it generates, it would just let it, in many places, it would just let it flow directly outside its bottling plants. Just let it out, okay? And what happens to that water? One place I went, it was there for 1 day, 2 days. It was a mango, it was a big mango growing area in Varanasi, some of you may know. And there's a lot of mango trees there. And so there's water like, 3-4 feet water just sitting there 1 day, 2 days, 3 days. But yes, after 4 or 5 days, it disappeared. But where did it go? Some of it perhaps evaporated, but the vast majority actually leached back into the groundwater and contaminated that groundwater. Right? So this is the story of Coca-Cola in India. And one is that they are depriving a lot of people. And we're talking about India, some of the villages that we work with, where we have active campaigns against Coca-Cola. The population of this village, for example, in Rajasthan, is 10,000 people. Okay, in the United States, it would be a town but in India, it still remains a village because of the characteristic of this area, which is largely still very agrarian. And so when we look at the impacts, or when we looked at tallied up the impacts, it was dramatic. I mean, we're talking about tens of thousands of farmers in India being impacted as a result of Coca-Cola's operations. And for farmers, and as I said, we're a very largely agrarian country. If you take away the water and you poison the remaining water and the soil, that is a sure recipe for disaster. And that is what the Coca-Cola company is guilty of in India. It is destroying lives, it is destroying livelihoods, and it is destroying communities across India. We know of places that even scientists have agreed, and natural resource experts have agreed with us, that if Coca-Cola continues to do business as usual as they're doing, that is to make it, mine for water and make products, there will be no community left here in the next 10 to 15 years because there will be no water left that is tappable anymore. This is how bad the situation is. And so this is the bad news, and I'm going to give you the good news. So there's a lot of, and PepsiCo hasn't had a terribly different record. It is less, there are less organic campaigns against Pepsi operations in India than Coca-Cola, but that does not mean that Pepsi is not the target of some of these campaigns. They, in fact, are. But in some places, I'm a campaigner. I'm not a farmer. And I choose to do what I do, and I've been doing this for 10 years. But in contrast to the people I work with in India who are not necessarily campaigners, and what they're doing is they're fighting for their lives, okay, because they are seeing their water resources dwindle and their farmland being poisoned. And for them, it is a clear matter of fighting for survival, for their wages, because many farmers, for example, have gone into debt, deep into debt, because suddenly they find themselves that there's not enough water to have successful crop production, so their incomes have reduced, depends on who you speak to or which area you're looking at, sometimes by up to a half of what they used to make. And as it is, India is, economically speaking, a poor country. And so what we started to see was these organic, women and farmers starting to get very angry and always pointing the finger at the Coca-Cola's factory, that ever since that factory started is when our problems started. And they started to organize themselves in one area in Rajasthan, this desert place I told you about. That one factory was affecting water conditions in 50 different villages in the radius of that one factory. They all got together, started to talk to each other, and this is where when we were also involved. And in some places, the opposition to Coca-Cola and the sophistication of these local campaigns got so good and so strong that we shut down Coca-Cola's single largest bottling plant in March of 2004 in South India in a village called Plachimara. Okay, and this has been, is regarded as a David versus Goliath kind of story. It made the front page of New York Times and Wall Street Journal and stuff. Well, great, but the problem is we have many more to go. And we have had similar, we've had significant victories against Coca-Cola. It has been proved, for example, by the government that Coca-Cola is in fact responsible for water scarcity and pollution as well. And as I said, PepsiCo is not very different either. And so this is the campaign that I've been working on. We work a lot internationally. I work a lot in Europe, in the United States and Canada. We have worked with students, not so much Columbia, but at NYU, definitely, at Rutgers, at University of Michigan, University of Illinois, University of Manchester, Sussex University, the entire Norwegian college and university system to actually remove Coca-Cola from their campuses as a result of the abuses that they're dishing out in India. And it has had a tremendous impact on this company. We also we use a variety of different tactics, including working with socially responsible investors, shareholder activism, but also we don't shy away from direct action, which was one of the things that Dana was talking about in terms of oppositional. Because we are very much opposed to what this company is doing. In spite of all the stuff that we have gotten done and continue to get done, and most importantly, our campaign has never been stronger than it is today. And the reason for that is that now a lot of these community allegations, right, that these communities are like, oh, it's this company, have been proved finally. Rajendra Pachauri, some of you may know, he's the chair of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and he's the guy who shared the Nobel Peace Prize with Al Gore. His group is called the Energy and Resources Institute in India. It's the largest NGO in India. His group did a study because we forced, through University of Michigan, through our campaign at University of Michigan, and even his group came out and said that, in fact, Coca-Cola needs to shut down another bottling plant because because it's not sustainable. So we are very, very strong, but but we also face a lot of challenges because we're talking about Coca-Cola and Pepsi, and this is what this is why we maintain that as you do your work, as we collectively do our work, make sure you're always keeping an eye on these big companies and what they're up to, because I tell you, they're not up to very good. Because as far as they're concerned, it's not about saving the world or saving the climate. That's not what drives them. In fact, that is not within their mandate. I know some of you may have been following the whole notion around corporate social responsibility, and some companies are coming out really strong with CSR, and Coca-Cola is one of them. But CSR, or corporate social responsibility, is not the primary duty of these corporations. In fact, they would be, in a sense, breaking the law if they were to go out and make saving the world as their primary mission, because their primary mission to their shareholders is to maximize profits. And what we're seeing in India is that many companies, not just Coca-Cola, Pepsi as well, are using these crises, these emerging crises, whether it be with water, and access to water in India is definitely a crisis. Climate change is something that plays a part, but it's not just climate. We've had an emerging water crisis for many years because of irresponsible water use, say by farmers, yeah, but by industry as well. And these companies now we see are positioning themselves in this game because they understand that in countries like India and China, and these are very big countries, I'm sure all of you recognize. I mean, we are together 40% of the world's population, and we are on a very rapid growth, right? A trajectory of growth. But you have to understand that when it comes to fresh water, India and China, we are 40% of the world's population, but we only have access to 7% of the world's freshwater resources. And as we grow, whether it's energy is very water intensive. You need a lot of water, no matter whether it's coal, coal-fired power plant, or whether it's nuclear energy, right? Which they're pushing into India as well. And so we are reaching our limits, and there is indeed a crisis. In fact, the BBC reported yesterday, but the Nature magazine has a wonderful news story on this water crisis that's facing India and China and the rest of the world as well. This is their current issue. And as a result of this, what we're seeing is that many of these companies are trying to get control over vast amounts of water resources in countries like India and China, but also in the continent of Africa and different parts of Africa. And they're doing this in different ways. I mean, they're working with the International Monetary Fund, they're working with the World Bank, they're working with the United States government, they're definitely working with Bill Clinton, and Hillary Clinton, who happen to be very, very close friends with Coca-Cola, it seems, and any chance they get, they're promoting Coca-Cola, to go into different countries, including places like Haiti. After the earthquake, the devastating earthquake, Bill Clinton announced this new project so that Coca-Cola can go into Haiti and help them plant mango trees so that they can make mango drinks for the rest of the world. And this is what we call disaster capitalism. You look at what is disastrous, and you try to take advantage meaning how you can profit the most from it. And we're seeing this trend over and over again, and this is something that we very much reject. And the other, alongside this, we see that companies like Coca-Cola are also very aggressively positioning themselves as through the use of public relations as this very green company. Coca-Cola, I mean, if you go to their website and look at what they have to say about water, and if you didn't know the address and didn't see their logo, you'd think it would be a group like ours who's working on conserving water, stuff you're reading. I mean, it's just, if you go to they have a museum in Atlanta, brand new, it's about 3 years old now. It's like water is life. I mean, these are the kind of things that we have used, and they have mastered this. They've hired an anthropologist to head up their water program in around the world. And he talks from that anthropology stuff. But I must say, because I'm at Columbia University here, Pepsi is no different. Pepsi and Indra Nooyi, their CEO, is on a fast track to suddenly become the saviors of the world by two things. One is that they're such a green company. Hey, they're not. I mean, they take water away from people, and so does Coca-Cola. Secondly, Pepsi is on a fast track to become a nutrition company. Okay, this is the company that sells us Frito-Lay chips. Okay, this is the company that sells and places aggressively, along with Coca-Cola, these high sugar products in our schools that has led to the United States having an obesity epidemic today, which many people, experts included, they look at the role of these junk food companies at the center of it. So it comes as a sort of a, we're not very happy that the Earth Institute here at Columbia University has taken a grant from PepsiCo Foundation of $6 million over 3 years to do what? To promote sustainable use of water around the world for the next 3 years. Give me a break. I mean, this is nothing more than a greenwash exercise, and now they're using a university with a good reputation like Columbia University to go ahead and do this. And not only that, I mean, so they have, what do they do? And their focus is not the entire world, even though they say world, but guess where their focus is? No surprise, India, China, South Africa, right, and Brazil. Who are these countries? We are the emerging economies. These are the countries where Coca-Cola and PepsiCo and companies like that want to get more control over not just the water resources, but they want every Indian to be drinking. The thing about Coca-Cola is, and PepsiCo, let's take Coca-Cola. The average Indian today drinks about 4 cans of Coca-Cola, okay, in a year, okay? In the United States, it's about 380. So what do you think these PepsiCo and Coca-Cola want? They want every Indian and every Chinese and every Brazilian, right, to become like the United States and Mexico. Mexico is number 1 in terms of consumption of Coca-Cola in the world. But not surprisingly, Mexico has some of the highest obesity rate in the world, and so does the United States. Okay, where, I mean, we have a huge problem here. And so the other aspect, in addition to sort of getting the water resources, the other aspect of these companies, what they're trying very much to do is to control our marketplaces, because they are losing their sales as a result of people becoming more nutritionally savvy in countries like the United States and in Germany and places. They're actually seeing not a rapid decline in sales, but definitely stagnant, yeah? And in some countries it's going down, but not too rapidly. But they know it's going to go, their products are under attack in the United States. Even, I live in Berkeley, California, even Arnold Schwarzenegger is the man who signed the bill that banned the sale of Coca-Cola and Pepsi and carbonated sugar beverages from all our high schools and down, okay? And so, I mean, there is this huge awareness, and so they know that. So what do they want to do? They want to take their products to places like India and China. And what we say is that, look, if junk food, whether it be your potato chips and stuff, or whether it be your carbonated beverages, high sugar beverages. If it's bad for the health of Americans and people in Europe, why is it any good for us in India and China? I mean, it is just like the tobacco companies did, right? I mean, this is what once they got regulated here, they moved their markets to China, or they tried very much. So it comes for us, we're not very happy to see why Columbia University is actually engaged in this greenwashing exercise with PepsiCo. And so if anybody actually is interested in working with us, and we do this work a lot. I mean, we do a lot of monitoring. We also do a lot of advocacy, a lot of education. And in India, we call, which you didn't have on your list, is agitation. Indians love to agitate, right? So, because if you get agitated about something, which we are about Coca-Cola and Pepsi, then we agitate about it, which means a whole range of things, but definitely, direct action. But if people here are interested, you should definitely be in touch with us, because we have been in touch with PepsiCo because of some outrageous statements that both Coca-Cola and Pepsi have made. And I'm going to end with that. I mean, the public relations is a big part of what we have to fight with. And Coca-Cola and PepsiCo have tremendous amount of resources that they spend on public relations. Coca-Cola company, for example, last year, 2009, we think it spent about $9 billion just in advertising. There is no company that comes close to advertising, to putting so much money into advertising. And you take that, and what can, there's not a whole lot that we can do. But a lot of this is also about, forming alliances with universities like Columbia, but you're not alone. It's Yale University as well is a part of this, a part of a separate initiative. But it's also about manufacturing a certain message that may not have any basis in reality. And we're seeing this very much. For example, Coca-Cola claims that in India it is a water-neutral company. Coca-Cola is saying it has no impact whatsoever on water resources in India. And when Pepsi found out, Pepsi said, hey, we can do one better. So Pepsi just announced a month ago that they have a positive water balance in India. In other words, as a result of their operations in India, Indians get more water than we already have, which made us think, like, wait a minute, if there's drought, let's build a Coca-Cola or a Pepsi bottling plant, right? This is exactly what they're suggesting. This is the extent to which they will go, and unfortunately, this is the extent to which Columbia University will actually allow them to go. I don't buy that. So hopefully we can work together and we can come up with something together. Okay, thank you very much.
It's over. But remember what he said, if anybody's interested, it's very important about Coca-Cola and Pepsi-Cola and Columbia University. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.